A shattered glass showing a reflection of a boy that looks uncontrollable, a swordmaster stuck in his room, and a madman. He is known as Count Perdium's useless oldest son, Ghislain Perdium. A knight covered in blood shakes in fear, asking himself how the best knight of the north was defeated by a garbage human being. A man in a hood, wielding a large axe and standing before a roaring fire, walks toward the northern knight. The hooded figure asks mockingly if the knight likes the trap he made for him. The knight, trembling, shouts Ghislain's name, refusing to believe that Ghislain knew his plans beforehand. Ghislain, with a calm but menacing tone, explains that he knew everything: their numbers, the spies among them, and who aided their reinforcements. Ghislain knew it all from the start. The northern knight, in disbelief, yells at Ghislain, but his words are cut off by a brutal kick to the face. Ghislain roars that no matter how many times they invade his land, he will always win because he knows their plans. 1 year ago, Lithania Kingdom near the Perdium estate. Ghislain wakes up, gasping for air, clutching his neck. He wonders why he's alive, vividly remembering his death at the hands of a golden-armored knight. This knight, known as Aiden, one of the continent's top 7 noble knights, had mocked Ghislain as the mercenary king met his end. Aiden's taunts about Ghislain's failed revenge and regret echo in his mind. Aiden had revealed that he and his allies in the Delphine household had orchestrated the downfall of the Perdium family. Enraged but helpless, Ghislain cursed Aiden before his head was severed. Now, alive and inexplicably back in his younger body, Ghislain struggles to make sense of his situation. He wonders if he's hallucinating or has been captured by mages for experiments. His thoughts are interrupted when Ricardo, a soldier of the Perdium household, calls out to him. Ghislain, still disoriented, grabs Ricardo at sword point, demanding answers. Ricardo, exasperated, pushes him back, reminding him of his tantrum earlier about leading a raid on orcs. Ghislain, confused but intrigued, follows Ricardo outside and is stunned to see the Perdium estate intact. Once a fallen household, it now stands proudly. Ricardo whispers, asking if Ghislain had a nightmare, as he'd referred to the estate as fallen. Ghislain pinches his cheek to confirm he isn't dreaming. Realizing he's been transported to the past, Ghislain vows to change his tragic future. Ghislain recalls his resentment toward his family, born from his own feelings of inadequacy. His immaturity caused strife, and eventually he ran away, only to return years later to find his family destroyed. Now, given a second chance, he knows it's too early to rejoice. His focus shifts to the orc raid Ricardo mentioned, a pivotal moment in his past where his stubbornness and inexperience led to countless deaths. This time, Ghislain intends to do things differently. As the raid squad prepares, Ghislain dons his gear. Suddenly, chaos erupts as an outpost crashes near them. Soldiers scramble as orcs overwhelm their formation. The squad commander, Skovin, shouts orders, but an orc sneaks up behind him. Ghislain pushes Skovin out of harm's way and charges at the orc, slicing its hand with a perfect stance. The soldiers, including Skovin, gape in disbelief at Ghislain's skill. Despite his lack of mana, Ghislain's determination burns brighter than ever. Walking toward Skovin, he demands command of the squad, ready to rewrite his fate and lead them to victory. Skovin hesitates because he knows that Ghislain is an idiot and doesn't want to put his soldiers' lives on the line. Skovin refused, and Ghislain was shocked. Skovin walks away and says that even if he is the young master, he cannot give the authority that the Lord of Perdium gave him. Ghislain was annoyed but expected that Skovin would react that way. Another orc charges towards Ghislain. Skovin jumps in front of Ghislain and asks him to fall back as Skovin knows that Ghislain is inexperienced to lead the troops. Ghislain, with no other option, throws his sword. Skovin barely dodged the sword, grabs, and shouts at Ghislain. Skovin paused and looked at the orc. The sword Ghislain threw hit the orc right in the head, killing the orc. Skovin was surprised and couldn't believe what he saw. Ghislain asked Skovin if he knew what was most important in battle. There's no hope in winning the battle if the troops are filled with fear. They need momentum. Ghislain ran to grab his sword and jumped over the group of orcs, landing on one of the orcs and stabbing the orc in the head. Skovin and the troops couldn't believe what they were seeing. Ghislain taunts them to come at him. Ghislain slashed the orcs one by one as the orcs attacked him. Skovin still couldn't believe what he witnessed, asking himself if he was dreaming. Orc heads dropped one after another. Skovin could already tell that Ghislain was getting tired. However, he noticed that Ghislain was using the smallest movements to dodge attacks, and used his swordsmanship to strike the weak spots of the orcs like a manaless sword master, or maybe even greater. Ghislain kept taunting the orcs. The troops thought that Ghislain was running away. Skovin was trying to figure out what Ghislain was planning to do. He lures the orcs, but now he's running away in the direction of the cliff. Skovin finally realizes what Ghislain is planning to do. Skovin commands the troops to raise the shield and follow Ghislain. Ghislain believed that Skovin would realize his plan, although he would prefer to slice the orcs down by himself, but he lacks the stamina to do it. The orcs noticed that Skovin and his troops were pushing behind them. Ghislain, realizing that Skovin was already doing what he planned, jumped to the cliff. Skovin and the troops pushed the remaining orcs back to the cliff, making the orcs fall. Skovin immediately looked for Ghislain on the cliff. Ghislain was safe while holding onto his sword that was stuck on the cliff. Ghislain smiled, and Skovin smiled back and offered his hand to the young master. But Ghislain lost his grip and fell. Everyone was shocked. Everything went dark. Then a voice of a young lady was heard calling for her brother. Ghislain recognized the voice of his sister Elena, remembering the past when she was still alive. Someone grabbed Ghislain. It was Elena shouting that they should go together. Then Ghislain woke up inside a room. Ghislain was alive. He tried to get up but felt the pain all over his body. The consequence of pushing himself to the limit. The pain meant he was still alive. A maid entered the room and was surprised to see that Ghislain was awake. Ghislain recognized Belinda immediately. Belinda, complaining how worried she was, told Ghislain that he should have let the soldiers handle the orcs. Ghislain, unable to contain his emotions, immediately hugged Belinda. Belinda, confused, asked Ghislain if he was feeling okay. Ghislain was just glad to see Belinda still alive. Belinda had been Ghislain's personal tutor since he was little. She was the one who stayed by his side despite his idiotic antics. But after the family fell to ruins, she went missing. Ghislain never thought that he'd see her again. Ghislain must tell Belinda the truth. Ghislain started blurting everything that happened to the Perdium household. Ghislain revealed to Belinda that he had died and came back to life. Belinda didn't believe him and thought that the orcs beat Ghislain too much and hurt his head. Instead, Ghislain got an earful from Belinda for putting his life in danger. Belinda reminds Ghislain to be careful if he wants to go to the festival. Ghislain suddenly remembered the festival. Belinda reminded Ghislain that his sister Elena had been waiting for the day to go to the festival with him. Ghislain picked up a picture of him and Elena and remembered that in his past life, he didn't have time to enjoy the festival because of his traumatic experience. Ghislain has only a week before the festival, the day that changes his life. The day Elena died. Ghislain hugged Elena tightly, closing his eyes. He was overwhelmed with emotion so intense it almost brought him to tears. To meet her again, alive and well, filled him with an overwhelming joy that tightened his chest. Elena was genuinely flustered. She pushed Ghislain away, and Ghislain couldn't believe that a child possessed such strength. In reality, she and Ghislain didn't get along very well. Elena looked at Ghislain with a suspicious gaze. He was still smiling, seemingly happier than ever. Ghislain apologized to Elena. Both Elena and Belinda were surprised that Ghislain apologized first. Elena thought Ghislain must have been hit in the head by the orcs. Ghislain explained that he had truly handled the orcs. However, he felt the pain again, making him fall to his knees. Seeing Ghislain in pain yet boasting, Elena stifled a laugh. Seeing her alive and laughing put a smile on Ghislain's face. He remembered the festival when he rejected Elena's offer to go together. That was the last time he saw her alive. Elena's body had been found shredded to pieces along with her bodyguards. Ghislain regretted what had happened. Elena's bodyguard knocked on the door. It was Jamal and Philip. They informed Elena that she was needed to oversee the servants' work on the festival supplies. Ghislain asked why they would burden Elena with such tasks. Belinda explained that there was a shortage of workers in Perdium, so even Elena had to pitch in. As Elena and her bodyguards were about to leave the room, Ghislain offered to help. Elena and Belinda were confused, thinking Ghislain had really been hit in the head. People were preparing for the festival. Elena kept pushing Ghislain away, but he remembered that her body had been found near the slums. He believed someone must have either lured or forced her there. To prevent that from happening, Ghislain knew he needed to understand the ins and outs of the castle first. Someone called for Ghislain. It was the old knight Fergus, who had rushed to find him as soon as he heard about the orcs. Elena commended Fergus for his perfect timing and asked him to take Ghislain back to his room. Ghislain had no choice but to comply, but he resolved to figure out what was happening around the castle in the following week. Ghislain asked Fergus to take him to the abandoned training grounds in the castle. Fergus asked why, and Ghislain replied that he wanted to train. Fergus's eyes widened in disbelief. When they arrived, Ghislain was surprised to find the training grounds in excellent condition. He had never seen anything like it during his time as a mercenary. Fergus explained that they had maintained it in case Ghislain ever decided to use it. Ghislain complimented Fergus for doing a good job, then told him he could leave as he planned to start training. Ghislain had always treated those around him as enemies, but now he realized how short-sighted he had been. He remembered that the one behind Elena's death had been a lord from a neighboring territory. Her death had been the catalyst for Perdium's downfall, dragging them into a war that ruined their house. Elena's death was the starting point of their misfortune, which meant Ghislain needed to prevent it at all costs. But first, he needed to train his physique in a short time. To do so, he also had to control mana. In this world, mana was a supernatural resource that allowed humans to surpass their limits. Most people said that sensing and harnessing mana was the hardest part, but Gizan had managed it even on chaotic battlefields. Gizan began connecting the mana particles floating in the air, bundling them as if spinning a spool. For someone like Gizan, who had experienced tens of thousands of battles, creating mana cores was almost second nature. Using methods from a half-burned book on magic he had picked up and the natural mana core within humans, Gizan created a second mana core, and even a third. He began weaving them into a connected mesh, generating explosive force. However, upon creating the third core, Gizan coughed up blood. It was his current limit, though he had reached 5 in his past life. This method allowed him to generate immense power in a short time, but it also consumed a massive amount of mana. This was why he had lost to Aiden in his past life. Aiden had brought an entire knight order to fight him when Gizan had run out of mana. In a fair fight, Gizan would have won. Wiping the blood from his mouth, Gizan vowed to get his revenge on Aiden. This time, he would also destroy everyone behind the Delphine house, those who had helped destroy Perdium. 1 week later, on the day of the festival, Gizan equipped his sword and gathered his items. Elena couldn't believe he had actually come to the festival. She noticed Gizan had been acting strangely and had heard he had done nothing but train over the past week. Gizan explained that, as the next in line for the family night role, he needed to train. Elena didn't believe him but admitted she liked how things were now, saying it seemed like the old Gizan was back. Gizan realized that his recent actions had started to change not only people's perception of him, but also the course of the future. He checked his items and walked alongside Elena, cautiously observing his surroundings. As the festival dragged on, Elena grew bored and sat down. The festival was nearly over, and nothing had happened yet. Then someone asked Elena if she wanted to check out other areas. She accepted the invitation. Gizan immediately realized who the culprit was. It was her bodyguards. Elena's escort knights were the most trusted in the feud, having protected Elena since she was a child. In Gizan's past life, it was known they were murdered while trying to protect her. They arrived at the location, but the area was empty. Elena looked around and saw nothing, while Gizan cautiously scanned their surroundings. Elena scolded Jamal as Gizan noticed obstacles blocking their exit. Elena grabbed Gizan, trying to leave, but Jamal attempted to persuade her to stay. Elena bumped into the other knight, Philip, who also asked the princess to remain. Elena was confused and began noticing that her bodyguards were acting strangely. Jamal, with a grin, requested they wait for their friends. A mysterious man, Frank, then appeared. He commended the knights on their work. Jamal proudly announced that he had brought the princess as promised and demanded payment. Frank noticed Gizan, whom he hadn't requested to be brought. Gripped by fear, Elena clung tightly to Gizan's arm. Jamal bargained, offering to hand over Gizan for free since he had foolishly followed them, unaware this would be his graveyard. Gizan warned Jamal that he wouldn't get away with this. Jamal smiled and mocked Gizan, telling him to worry about himself, as they planned to flee after the deal. Jamal added that they were tired of Perdium's impoverished land, constantly tormented by barbarians. Before Jamal could continue, Gizan swiftly struck, cutting him down before he could react. Elena and Philip were stunned, and even Frank was taken aback. Jamal's body fell, split in half. Gizan then turned to Philip, fury blazing in his eyes. Philip couldn't believe that a knight like Jamal had lost to what he perceived as an amateur. In desperation, he grabbed Elena as a hostage. Before Philip could make another move, Gizan's sword struck him in the head, eliminating him instantly. Elena clutched Gizan's arm even tighter, trembling and on the verge of tears. One of Frank's hooded bodyguards asked if they were sure Gizan was the eldest son of Perdium. They had assumed he had no combat experience. Frank couldn't believe Gizan had eliminated 2 knights in an instant using mana-infused attacks. With a trembling voice, Elena asked Gizan what was happening. Gizan didn't respond. Instead, he knocked her unconscious and carefully laid her on the ground. Gizan turned to Frank. Frank thanked him sarcastically for taking care of Philip and Jamal, admitting they had planned to dispose of them anyway. Frank asked if Gizan had been hiding his skills all along. As Gizan pulled his sword from Philip's head, he replied coldly, "What does that matter to you?" Gizan noticed that Frank was the only one capable of using mana. A string of mana emerged from Gizan's hands as he prepared to end the fight quickly. Gizan demanded to know who had ordered Elena's abduction, but Frank refused to answer. Gizan knew they wouldn't talk. Infusing mana into his sword, Gizan prepared to attack. Frank ordered his men to capture Gizan alive, instructing them to make a mess of their bodies to provoke Count Perdium's rage. He added that they should keep them alive as long as possible. It would be more satisfying to see them writhe in agony. 2 of Frank's men advanced on Gizan. Ghislain pulled out a firecracker and threw it at his attackers. Ghislain struck the firecracker, cutting it and hitting the man in the head in the process. The second attacker immediately reacted, but Ghislain blocked the attack and grabbed the man's sword. Using the momentum, he pulled the weapon free and decapitated the attacker in one swift motion. Suddenly, Ghislain felt an attack coming from behind. Despite the awkward position, he managed to block it. Frank was shocked that his perfect sneak attack had been deflected. Ghislain rotated his body to counter, slicing Frank's pipe and grazing his neck. Frank quickly retaliated to halt Ghislain's advance. He was alarmed. Had he been lacking in mana, his head would have been severed. Ghislain couldn't believe Frank had survived a strike to the neck. Frank, meanwhile, was baffled by Ghislain's strange and unorthodox swordsmanship, especially for someone his age. However, he vowed to make sure Ghislain died at his hands. Frank gathered more mana, hoping to end the fight quickly. He noticed that Ghislain was smiling. Ghislain deflected Frank's attack and simultaneously kicked him in the face. Frank smirked, saying that Ghislain's attack wouldn't work with the small amount of mana he had. Then Frank suddenly felt pain and started coughing. He realized that Ghislain's power was different. Ghislain had been able to pierce through his defense enhancement. Ghislain walked toward Frank, convinced that Frank wasn't the mastermind behind Elena's death. Ghislain warned Frank to prepare himself as he opened his third core. Frank was stunned at how greatly Ghislain boosted his mana. Ghislain leaped to attack Frank with such speed that Frank had no time to counter. All he could do was block. Frank couldn't believe it. His hands were turning numb just from the force of Ghislain's strikes. His sword began to crack under the relentless assault. Frank had never heard of a method that could increase mana so explosively. Ghislain prepared an even stronger attack. Frank's sword finally shattered, and Ghislain's strike injured him. But Ghislain wasn't done. His sword pierced Frank's core, located just below his navel. Ghislain demanded to know who had ordered Elena's death. Frank refused to talk, instead using a hidden knife to try to kill Elena. However, a red string of mana appeared, stopping Frank from throwing the dagger. Ghislain offered Frank a deal. He would sheath his sword if Frank answered his question. Frank, staring at the mana thread in disbelief, hesitated. Ghislain threatened to destroy Frank's core, causing Frank to panic. Ghislain charged his mana and transferred it into Frank's core, causing it to crack. Frank screamed, warning that the mana could explode and obliterate the entire area. Ghislain calmly assured him that he could handle it. Realizing Ghislain wasn't bluffing, Frank shouted that it was Count Desmond who had ordered the assassination. He added that the Count needed a pretext to start a war against the Perdium and Degard families. Ghislain drove his blade further into Frank's body. Frank screamed, protesting that Ghislain had promised not to kill him. Ghislain mocked Frank for being afraid now that it was his time to die. Frank laughed bitterly, saying that nothing would change even if Ghislain killed him. He revealed that the Degard family had already been implicated, and that no one would believe someone like Ghislain. Ghislain slammed Frank's head against the wall, declaring that he had been reborn and that things would be different this time. Frank screamed in agony as Ghislain infused his mana into Frank's core, destroying it. Fireworks from the festival lit up the sky as the fight ended. Blood splattered the walls, and both Ghislain and Frank lay on the ground. Ghislain looked at Elena, who remained sound asleep. Dropping his sword, he sighed in relief. Suddenly, Ghislain felt a sharp pain and fell to his knees, coughing blood. It was the backlash from using 3 cores during his fight with Frank. Struggling to his feet, Ghislain noticed a door to one of the nearby houses. He kicked it open and found 2 dead bodies inside. In his past life, another body had been discovered alongside Elena's at the crime scene. The son of the Degard family and his escort knight. Their deaths had been used to frame Degard's son for Elena's murder, sparking the war. Determined to prevent history from repeating itself, Ghislain decided to burn the house and erase the evidence. He would not let events unfold as his enemies had planned. As the flames engulfed the building, a mysterious hooded figure observed Ghislain from afar before vanishing into the night. The mysterious hooded man spoke to a group of men seated at a round table, stating that the plan had failed. The men at the table began complaining about the outcome. The hooded man explained that the failure was due to Ghislain Perdium. One of the men scoffed, arguing that everyone knew how useless Ghislain was and accusing the hooded man of using him as an excuse. The hooded man insisted that the Ghislain he encountered was entirely different, as if he were a changed person. However, the hooded man assured the group that they had already dealt with the Degard family, so starting a territorial war would not be an issue. He asked for one more chance. The men were reluctant, voicing their desire to eliminate the hooded man for his failure. At that moment, a mysterious man who appeared to be the leader spoke, silencing everyone. The leader asked what kind of chance the hooded man wanted. The hooded man proposed getting rid of Ghislain. The leader questioned how he planned to eliminate Ghislain. The hooded man revealed his plan to orchestrate a duel, using Cain Loges as the challenger. Cain, known for his exceptional strength-based swordsmanship despite his young age, was the epitome of power. The hooded man added that Cain was Gislin's cousin, making it easy to arrange their meeting without suspicion. The group fell silent, waiting for the leader's decision. The leader warned the hooded man that if he failed again, there would be no next time. Meanwhile, in the Perdium training hall, Fergus entered to call Gislin for mealtime. Suddenly, a string of mana grabbed the sword beside Fergus, pulling it to Gislin. Startled, Gislin noticed Fergus and apologized for not realizing he had entered. Fergus, amazed by what he had witnessed, asked Gislin how he did it. Gislin explained that it was a mana thread, a technique that used mana like a string. In his past life, he had often relied on this ability. Fergus, astonished, wondered how Gislin had come up with such an idea, especially since he had never used mana or trained before. Fergus thanked Gislin for saving Elena. Gislin replied that it was his duty and there was no need for thanks. Days passed, and the festival was paused due to the incident. At the dining table, Elena, wearing a sour expression, complained that no one believed her when she said Gislin had saved her. She urged Gislin to speak up and clarify the matter. Gislin brushed it off, saying it didn't matter since no one would believe them anyway. Belinda, visibly angry, cursed Jamal and Philip for trying to take Elena. Gislin smiled while watching Elena and Belinda bicker. Although he had stopped the war, he was certain that whoever was behind it wouldn't give up so easily. Gislin knew he couldn't stop them forever and resolved to build a military force. When the food arrived, Gislin was shocked to see that all they had was a slice of bread. He asked Belinda why they were starting with dessert. Belinda smiled and explained that Gislin should already know their dire situation. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted outside. Merchants were protesting, demanding compensation for the cancelled festival. Gislin was puzzled by the uproar, but Belinda wasn't surprised. She explained that the merchants relied on the festival for their livelihood, so it made sense for them to be upset after its abrupt cancellation. Gislin began to grasp just how dire their county's situation was and realized he needed to address the merchants' grievances. Gislin asked Fergus to send soldiers to calm the crowd. Fergus replied that there were no soldiers available. Most had been dispatched to the monster-infested forest for reconstruction after an orc raid. Perdium was perpetually at war, with barbarians to the north and monsters threatening from the forest. Gislin, disappointed, realized they had no money and no soldiers. He called Belinda to discuss their finances. Belinda, who managed Gislin's funds, revealed there was no money available to appease the merchants. Shocked, Gislin asked where the money had gone. Belinda explained that the Count had cut off his allowance due to his reckless spending habits. It dawned on Gislin that he was broke. Desperate, he asked Belinda to lend him some money, but she had none either. Frustrated, Gislin sat by the window, contemplating how to resolve the situation. He realized that even with his knowledge of the future, he would need money to take action. Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ricardo rushed in, shouting for Gislin. When Gislin asked what was wrong, Ricardo explained that Cain wanted to see him. Gislin stepped outside and was stunned to see Scoven beaten and lying on the ground. Standing over Scoven was none other than Gislin's cousin, Cain. Gislin remembers Cain's face as the heir of the Loges County, with whom he has both an alliance and enmity. Gislin asked Ricardo about the current situation. Ricardo explained that they responded to a report of a disturbance at the tavern and found Cain there with his escort knight. Cain recognized them and inquired about the rumor regarding Gislin. Scoven explained the details of the rumor to Cain, but Cain grabbed him, accusing him of lying. Cain asked Gislin if it was true that he never trained yet managed to take down an orc with his bare hands. Cain dismissed it as a lie, which is why he beat up Scoven. Gislin remembered that Cain always treated him as a subordinate. Every time Cain visited Perdium, he caused a mess. Unlike Gislin, Cain was never looked down upon. Gislin, plagued by an inferiority complex, watched as Cain's confidence and bold demeanor were praised as qualities befitting an heir. That only led to Gislin facing more criticism. Cain noticed that Gislin wasn't reacting to the provocation, which was unusual. A while ago in Loges County, the hooded man, who was Cain's escort knight, suggested that Cain eliminate Gislin. The man explained to Cain that, if he succeeded, the esteemed one would support the Loges family. Cain responded that while it was difficult to deal with someone like Gislin, he was still an heir to his land. Cain asked how he was supposed to eliminate him. The man explained they would lure Gislin into a duel and make it seem like a trivial dispute between heirs. The man added that he would accompany Cain disguised as an escort knight. He reminded Cain that this was a rare opportunity. Cain didn't hesitate and agreed. Cain demanded that Gislin liven up the mood and have an amazing time. Gislin remained unbothered. He remembered how Cain always made him prepare alcohol and women whenever he visited, forcing Gislin to waste his precious money. Then, Gislin had an epiphany. Cain could be a source of money. Cain shouted at Gislin, demanding alcohol and women immediately. Ghislain responded that he could provide them, but first demanded that Cain pay his debt. The hooded man was surprised by Ghislain's boldness. Cain, puzzled, asked what debt he was talking about. Ghislain smiled and explained that he had been covering all of Cain's requests and paying for them out of his own pocket. He demanded repayment, 1,000 gold plus interest. Cain, shocked, argued that Ghislain did it out of gratitude, calling it a friendship fee. Ghislain dismissed the explanation and demanded payment, threatening to beat Cain if he didn't pay. The room fell silent, and Ricardo was stunned by Ghislain's provocation. Cain stood up and sneered at Ghislain, accusing him of acting bold only because Cain had been going easy on him. Cain insulted Ghislain, calling him a parasite leeching off Perdium land. Cain clenched his fist and swung at Ghislain, but missed. Ricardo and the hooded man were shocked. Cain tried a backhand strike, but missed again. Ghislain countered with a punch to Cain's gut, catching him off guard. Ghislain followed up with another punch, but Cain managed to block it. Ghislain stared at Cain, as though waiting for something. Cain suddenly dropped to his knees. The hooded man rushed to help him, but Ghislain insulted Cain, telling him to stop whining. He mocked Cain, saying he knew the punch had been blocked. The hooded man shouted at Ghislain, drawing the attention of everyone in the tavern. Ghislain immediately understood their ploy. Cain asked the man how his acting was, to which the man replied it was excellent. They had staged the scene perfectly to make Ghislain appear as the aggressor. Cain was ready to throw his gloves to initiate the duel, but Ghislain threw his gloves first, challenging Cain instead. Ghislain accused Cain of insulting him in front of the Perdium people, assaulting his knight, and tarnishing the dignity of nobility. He warned Cain not to deny it. Cain smiled smugly, calling Ghislain foolish for digging his own grave. Drawing his massive sword, Cain accepted the duel and pointed it at Ghislain, warning him not to regret it, even if he died. Ghislain then instructed Ricardo to bring all the protesting merchants from in front of the castle, promising them that he'd make them a ton of money. Since the festival was cancelled, the tourists who had come for it must have been left in a state of incomplete combustion, unable to spend their money or time. To soothe them, Ghislain created an event. The arena was now filled with people shouting about the duel between Cain and Ghislain. Merchants were selling their goods near the arena, and betting had begun. Everyone was betting on Cain, and money flowed like water. Cain made it clear to Ghislain that his sword would not stop even if Ghislain surrendered. Ghislain understood that this was exactly what they were after. He was ready to start the duel, but Cain's escort knight interrupted, claiming that a proper bet couldn't proceed at this rate. Everyone was confused. The reason? Nobody had bet their money on Ghislain. The crowd chattered about how obvious it was that Ghislain would lose, and Cain insulted him, pointing out that even the marketplace was ignoring him. Then, Scoven arrived and placed a bet on Ghislain. Ghislain smiled, touched by Scoven's faith in him. Elena and Belinda also placed bets on Ghislain. Ghislain was stunned, especially since he thought they didn't have any money. Belinda reminded Elena that she had advised against it. Cain grew irritated at the delay and demanded they start. With the bets finalized, the duel began. Ghislain drew his sword, looked at Cain and said, "Come at me." Cain leaped like a gorilla and struck, but Ghislain blocked the powerful blow. Cain followed with another strike, but Ghislain dodged it. Cain attempted a kick, but missed again. Smiling, Cain eyed Ghislain, while Elena and the others watched with growing fear, witnessing the sheer power of Cain's attacks. Cain unleashed a barrage of strikes, yet Ghislain dodged them all as if it were nothing. Frustrated, Cain switched his grip and attempted a new technique, but Ghislain still managed to block it. Cain then used the hilt of his sword as a hook, pulling Ghislain and throwing him into the air. The crowd gasped, and the hooded man thought it was over. Cain waited for Ghislain to fall, but instead Ghislain landed on the roof, using mana to boost his legs. He then rushed toward Cain at incredible speed, striking him. Both Cain and the hooded man were stunned. Ghislain stood confidently and mocked Cain, calling his swordsmanship ignorant. He added that Cain must have thought his strength alone would intimidate him. Taking a stance, Ghislain declared, "Allow me to open your eyes." Insulted, Cain immediately attacked. Ghislain spun and performed a spinning kick, hitting the handle of Cain's sword. Using the momentum, he leaped into the air and landed a strike on Cain. Cain retaliated with a thrust, but Ghislain dodged and slammed Cain's sword into the ground with his foot. He then struck Cain on the neck. A hiss of blood emerged from the spot where Ghislain had hit Cain. The arena fell silent. No one could believe what they were seeing. Ghislain was overwhelming Cain. The silence broke as the crowd erupted, shouting that Ghislain had improved significantly. Many regretted betting on Cain. Elena, with a proud expression, turned to Belinda and said, "See?" Cain realized that his wound was shallow and that Ghislain could have made it deeper if he wanted to. He understood that Ghislain had held back intentionally. Disbelief filled Cain's mind. How could someone like Ghislain possess such mastery? Ghislain then looked down at Cain, threw his sword aside, and declared that the gap in their skills was too wide for the fight to be entertaining. He announced that he would fight Cain with his bare hands instead. Cain felt deeply insulted, but Gizan saw this as an opportunity to teach him a lesson, with his fists. Cain, with a confused but irritated expression, asked Gizan, "Educate me?" Gizan responded, "Yes, since you're no match for me in swordsmanship, I'll give you a handicap and ask for a fist fight, something you excel in." Gizan added, "Instead, I'll bet 2,000 more gold, twice the initial amount, that I'll win." The crowd grew confused, and even the hooded man was shocked. The man never thought he'd feel grateful for Gizan's apparent insanity, thinking they still had a chance to win now that the duel shifted to a fistfight. The bookie shouted, encouraging everyone to place new bets for the fistfight. This time, some people began betting on the young Lord Gizan. Cain, feeling insulted, laughed, grabbed his sword, and said to Gizan, "Go ahead and fight with your fists, but I'll use my sword." Gizan, expecting this reaction, dodged Cain's strike, sidestepped, and hit Cain in the gut, following up with an uppercut to the jaw. Cain fell to his knees, stunned by Gizan's precise movements. The crowd roared with cheers for the young master. Gizan commanded Cain to get up, stating, "I haven't even started yet." Filled with rage, Cain dashed toward Gizan, striking repeatedly but missing each time. Gizan grabbed Cain's right hand, twisted it, and kneed him in the side. He followed up with a barrage of punches, leaving Cain's face swollen. Grabbing Cain by the hair, Gizan said he pitied Cain's father. He reminded Cain that Count Loges had supported Perdium, even when his own estate was struggling, purely because of his friendship with Gizan's father. A flashback revealed an argument years ago at the Count Loges estate. Cain had asked his father why he kept sending support to Perdium despite their hardships. He begged his father not to go and questioned why he insisted on helping Perdium. His father simply responded, "Because we are friends, there's no other reason." Cain recalled this memory as Gizan's fist neared his face. Cain closed his eyes, bracing for the blow, but instead heard Gizan say, "This should have educated you enough." Opening his eyes, Cain saw Gizan offering his hand to help him up. Cain admitted his defeat in front of everyone. The arena fell silent for a moment before erupting in cheers. "Young Lord Gizan has won," they shouted. Elena joined the cheering, while Belinda stood in shock. The hooded man ran to Cain, angrily shouting, "How could you admit defeat so early?" Cain simply replied, "I'm done." The hooded man, clearly frustrated, heard Gizan call out to him. Smiling, Gizan said, "I gotta do what I gotta do, right?" The man, confused, didn't understand what Gizan meant until he heard Gizan announce to the crowd that the hooded man had volunteered to pay for all the meat and drinks for everyone in the arena. The man, shocked, protested, claiming he hadn't agreed to such a thing. Gizan grabbed his shoulder and said, "This is the price for losing the duel," then pushed the man to his knees. Gizan reminded him to add 2,000 gold to the original 1,000 gold bet. He warned the man about the consequences if he tried to run. Left with no choice, the hooded man reluctantly agreed. The next day, in Gizan's room, he opened a chest full of gold coins. He realized he now had enough to hire a small mercenary corps, but decided he needed to grow the money further to fund the business he had in mind. Suddenly, Belinda and Elena appeared beside him, smiling. "What is it?" Gizan asked. Elena asked where he planned to spend all the money. Gizan teasingly asked if she wanted some, but Elena insisted she was just curious. Belinda chimed in, saying it was obvious. Gizan planned to use the money to buy Lady Amelia a very expensive present for her birthday. Gizan went silent, confused. Elena added, "You did all that just to look good for your fiancé." Gizan, more confused than ever, realized he didn't even know he had a fiancé. Alright, that's a wrap for today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.